Happy Thursday, everybody. I'm going to practice a psychic exercise to start today. See if I can read your collective minds. I know what you're thinking. I'm picking up signals. I'll just get it out of the way, yeah? I voted for Hillary Clinton. So that's just, before that I voted for Obama twice. Before that I voted for John Kerry. Before that I voted for Al Gore. Before that I'm having trouble remembering. Probably Bill Clinton. Probably. So, was I right? Something you were wondering about?
Well, you were saying before that it sounded like you were always voting for those who were losing, so you should have always voted for Trump this time.
Yes, probably. Yeah. So if my energy seems a little bit disturbed today, that's probably the something, the energy propagating outwards. So I just passed around an attendance sheet so I could get an idea of the backgrounds on all of you attendees. Before I jump in with the new lecture, I have printouts from the first one. Did anybody miss the first one? I guess I'll just hand those around just in case anybody missed the first one. Oh, yeah, they're going to be handed around. And here are the handouts for the exciting second one. The second seminar is more exciting than the first one. I know that's hard to imagine.
Because I was like trying to explain maths basically.
Does anybody have any questions before we start?
I'm being paid real money already. Well, what is this like?
Okay, I have some questions for you guys then. How many people here have tried to read scientific research papers before?
What do you mean trying?
Well, that's a good question. Did you understand everything in the scientific research paper, the papers that you read?
I question the principle of fully understanding anything or anyone.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. For everybody that's been reading the research papers, has anybody found it to be a difficult exercise? Like I've read thousands of them, and I still find it. There are some parts that are challenging. I don't know how many research papers I actually read because I review a lot, but it's got to be in the thousands by now. So reading, so has anybody, one more question, has anybody thought to themselves, wow, how do I navigate through this big pile of scientific literature? Like, how am I gonna manage that? Has anybody wondered that before? Like, it's not easy, is it? So this is one of the biggest challenges of being any researcher. It doesn't matter if you're a PhD student, but it matters more. Well, arguably even more if you're a PhD student. But it's a challenge that's everybody in the scientific community faces. How to navigate through the vast jungle of previously published literature. Very, very challenging. And it's challenging for me too, even though I have lots of years of experience. And I would love to hear from the person that says, oh, I've mastered that challenge. I have that fully under control. I have never heard anybody say that before. And trying to navigate the vast numbers of previously published papers is identified as one of the top challenges in any scientific field, right? So today we're going to learn the solution. Or we're not going to learn a 100% bulletproof solution, but you're going to learn a strategy on how to cope with the vast volume of previously published papers. Does that sound exciting? This is exciting stuff, actually. I wish I had had this material when I was a student, when I was a PhD student. I remember seeing some of my predecessor PhD colleagues and seeing these huge stacks of research papers on their desks, and you can find people like that print out the research papers and have big stacks on their desks, and just wondering how the heck can anybody manage that complexity, that volume of information? Like, how is that possible? And I don't know if I drew a conclusion, but I think my conclusion was that's impossible. Like, that is impossible. And in some ways it's true, but we're going to learn about a strategy to handle that or to manage that today. And it's exciting. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? Did everybody get the copies of the handouts? The attendance register is somewhere. Everybody's still signing in. Okay, so let's talk about it. This is what we're going to talk about. We already started motivating the topic. There is related literature on this subject, right? So people have published papers that are not exactly on this topic, but close to it, very close to it. We're going to introduce the idea of close versus distant reading, or distant versus close reading. This might be something new for most of you. We're going to also discuss concept versus implementation. This is also going to be new for most of you, I think. Maybe not everybody, but most of you. These are very important, and these are actually the two key tools, the two key ideas that help you navigate the millions of previous papers. And then we're going to go through the mechanics. Okay, now that we have the ideas, how do we put this into practice, right? And we're gonna talk about extracting the essentials of a scientific research paper, and we're going to go through different examples from each of the different top subjects, right? Computer science, physics, mathematics, bioscience, and geography. And then we're just going to mention a little bit about breadth versus depth. I mean, I'm excited. I even know, like, what's to come, but just looking at that, I just think that's so cool. And this is fun for me, too, because I'm not I do have a bachelor's degree in physics, but I would never call myself a physicist. And I don't call myself a mathematician or a bioscientist or a geography person or a geographer. So I did this exercise on the other topics, what I'm about to present. So that was fun for me. Like, oh, is this going to work? Is this what we're going to talk about today going to actually work for all the different subjects? That was a fun exercise just for me, right? Because I don't have very much practice with physics and mathematics and bioscience and geography. If there are any questions or comments in the middle, feel free to interrupt or just raise your hand at any time. So what's the goal? Why are we here? We want to determine, or you want to determine, I do too, we want to determine solved and unsolved problems. Right? That's the overarching goal, the overarching purpose. Right? Because we want to work on unsolved problems. That's what a PhD is all about. Trying to identify unsolved problems and work on those. Anybody here ever work on a solved problem? Yes, it's very easy, right? Very easy to do that. Happens all the time. What's the challenge? A single paper can be very complex. It can have, for example, a detailed mathematical framework. It can have complex techniques and methods and a complicated data analysis, right? That is a challenge. A single research paper is generally the result of multiple man-years worth of work. Usually the papers have 2 authors, 3 authors, 5 authors, 10 authors, right? All contributing their years of expertise into that final product, right? The total sum of man-years put into an individual paper could be 5 or 10 or 20 years, right? If you add up all the time spent by all the authors contributing to a paper. That's a lot of knowledge, right, being channeled into a publication. There's a very large volume of previous literature, right? Very challenging. That also makes this whole process challenging. And as we mentioned, keeping up with the literature explosion is identified as one of the top challenges in any field. And I've never heard anybody disagree with that. And this is true for all fields. It's not just science. It's true for everything, everybody, everywhere. And then the question is how? How do we navigate through this massive complexity? Right? That's the money question. And it costs a lot of money to answer that question, actually. So, let's talk about how to do it. So, it's important to recognize that the goal is to determine solved and unsolved problems, but that not all the details in any published paper or in every published paper are necessary to understand when trying to get an overview of the literature and determine solved and unsolved problems. This is the first recognition that not all the information in the previously published literature is of equal importance. That's the first thing to notice. So what we're going to talk about is how to decide what's important in a research paper and what's not as important, and extracting the most important bits. Right, that's the approach we're going to describe. And what's our goal? There are multiple goals. One goal is to write a survey paper, a literature survey, right, which is your first year of PhD studies. You all work on a literature survey. It's also called a literature review or state-of-the-art report. And the reason you write this literature survey, it's a chapter in your thesis, it's a good way, the goal is to get a good overview of the literature and identify the solved and unsolved problems. That's the whole purpose, right? And these two goals determine what is important and what is not important when reading a paper. Right? And where did this material come from that we're going to talk about today? This comes from experience. This is based on my experience, not only my experience, but my advisor's experience, my former PhD advisor's experience, my former master's advisor's experience, and all of my co-authors that I've worked with on papers and survey papers over the last, since 1999. Right, so since 1999, I've been involved in about 10 survey papers. And we're actively working on some very exciting survey papers, even now, right? And PhD supervision experience. So I've been a PhD student. I have friends that were PhD students, and I've supervised PhD students. So that's where all of this information is coming from. Just as a side note, this is not the world's most important slide, but you might have wondered, okay, is there literature dedicated to this topic? Well, I haven't seen any literature dedicated exactly to this approach of extracting the essentials of a research paper, except some of the stuff that we have worked on. But you may have noticed there are lots of different papers related to writing surveys and literature reviews and those types of things, right? There are papers about writing literature reviews in psychology, right? There are lots of those. If you Google, like, writing a literature review, you'll find, I don't know, 1,000 hits or something like that on all different topics. What we're talking about here is a single research paper. Just a single one. Today, that's what we're talking about. Next time, we're going to talk about the survey, by the way. This is very specific. The focus is on a single research paper at a time and how to read it and extract the essentials. There are papers, if you're interested, on how to read a research paper for the purposes of reviewing, right? If you're a referee, you know that all research papers go through a refereeing process, and there are papers published about that, right? And they're interesting. They're very interesting, and I have read them. Like, I've read this one. I remember the first time I had to review a paper. I thought, oh, that's weird. How am I supposed to review a paper? Maybe there's a paper about that process. So I Googled it and found some papers, right? And they're very useful. And they do complement. They do complement. These are complementary items. Not exactly the same, but complementary. And you can also find literature on how to get your papers rejected, right? People have published papers saying, here's a good way, here are like the top 10 ways to get your papers rejected for publication. So you can find those. I just haven't seen anything quite like this, what we're going to talk about today, which makes it that much more special. Right? Sounds exciting, doesn't it? Who's excited about this?
But the rejection part would be more of a warning. This is what you don't want to do if you want to be published, right? Because otherwise I don't really find a scenario that gives me motivation to have my paper rejected.
Yes, that's a different stage of your career, so to speak. If you're a new PhD student, you're not worried about how to not get your paper rejected right now. You're worried about, where do I start? At the beginning, you're not worried about like the more advanced ending parts, right? So these seminars focus heavily on where to start, because this is where the gap is. This is the hardest part, is starting. Where to start. It's like you're just thrown in the water and it's like sink or swim, right? How do I start? That's where the gap exists in the literature. And that's what we're trying to address with this seminar series. We're trying to provide a starting point which doesn't really exist. It's hard to find. I don't know if any of you have tried to find this information already, but it's difficult to find. So let's introduce the ideas of close versus distant reading. So the idea of close reading, you actually all are already familiar with. You all know this already, but you haven't heard the term close reading used yet, maybe. So close reading is taking a paper, reading every word from start to finish, right, from the beginning to the end, just like a book. That's close reading. And you've all done that, and you all know that, and you all know what that is. You just haven't heard it called close reading yet until today. Here's a little image, right? That's an image that sort of represents the idea of close reading. Being able to see and read every single word on every single page, right? And it's literally close, like you have the paper in your hand. I guess that's where the term comes from. But there's also this notion of distant reading. Distant reading is trying to get an overview of a large number of papers and how they're related to each other. This is an example of distant reading right here. This is, each one of these glyphs represents a research paper, right? You can't read those research papers as it is, as it stands. You can see a glyph that represents some information about each paper, right? The color represents something. In this case, the color orange represents steady state data. So each one of these papers talks about static data, or data that doesn't change over time. And the green ones represent papers where the data is changing over time, right? Most of you will have time-dependent data in your studies, right? And not only can you see, so you can see that property about the paper, but you can also see other properties about the paper, right? And you can see, okay, this paper was published before all of these, so time is on the y-axis, right? In all of these papers cite this paper, right? So they were all published afterwards. And all of these papers cite this paper. So this one was published after that one, and so on. So you can see, you can get an overview of several papers at the same time, and that's an example of distant reading, right? We don't actually see the papers, we just see some sort of visualization of the papers, right? So distant is only seeing a visual representation of a paper, like a map or a graph, right? That's what we call distant reading. So why is that interesting? Today we're talking about something that's in between close and distant reading. We are going to read some words in the research paper, but we might not read all of the words in a research paper. This is sort of what something in between could look like, right? So, and this is a column that represents text, right? And somebody has clicked on a paragraph, and there's the paragraph close up, so we can see the individual words, right? And somebody has clicked on the same paragraph in a second paper or a second text, and they get the same paragraph here, but it's translated differently. This happens to be a visualization of translations, right? Two translations to compare with each other. So we're talking about we're not talking about close reading today, and we're not talking about distant reading today. We're talking about something in between, like semi-close reading or kind of close reading, you could call it. And before we jump into the examples and the methodology, there's some more background information we want to introduce. And this is great stuff. This is really great. I remember when I first learned this, or my master's thesis supervisor explained this to me, but I don't think he ever documented it. So we want to make a careful distinction between concept and implementation. This is very important for the close and distant reading concept, right? And for the extraction of essentials concept. So what is a concept? A concept, if we look it up in the dictionary, it says a general notion or idea, a conception. That's not the world's most helpful definition, but that's what happens. Another definition is an idea of something formed by mentally combining all of its characteristics or particulars, a construct. That is an interesting definition, really interesting definition of a concept. And then there's a third one, a directly conceived or intuited object of thought. It's kind of ironic here. The irony is where we're trying to describe the concept of a concept. Anyway, the idea is we want to understand, at least think that we understand the idea of what a concept is and be able to separate that and distinguish it from implementation. So what is implementation? The act of accomplishing some aim or executing some order, or the act of implementing, providing a practical means for accomplishing something, carrying into effect. So these dictionary definitions are confusing, and they might not have even helped you at this point. So we're going to go through this in more detail. But a concept, you can think of a concept as what? The word what? And implementation as the word how. That's a very quick and concise, short summary. Concept is what? Implementation is how. I'm just going to go through a few trivial examples. Here's another definition. An idea or a thought. A concept is abstract. It's not something with mass that can be weighed on a scale. A concept is something that exists in your imagination. And it really exists only in your imagination and in your mind. It doesn't have, you can't have a physical, as soon as you take a concept and you bring it into physical reality, it becomes an implementation. That makes sense. Implementation, an actualization or realization of a concept or idea. Right? An implementation is a concept that has been brought into reality. Right? So we've taken the concept and taken it out of the imagination and brought it into reality. So that's important to be able to distinguish the difference between these two things. Right? This is how, you might not have seen it yet, but this is how you navigate the vast collection of previously published literature. So a concept usually starts out as an idea in someone's mind. So here's a concept. A fun concept these days is democracy. Right? That's a concept. Democracy as a concept exists only in the imagination. So a thought-provoking question is, well, how do you implement democracy? How do you bring it into reality? Right? There are different versions of democracy, right? You might decide, if you live in a crazy country, you might decide to divide up the country into states and then form an electoral college, an all or nothing win situation for every state. That's an implementation of the concept of democracy, right? But people are unhappy with that implementation, right? Another implementation of democracy is just one vote for one candidate. Like each person, you just add the number of individual votes up, and the higher number wins. That's another implementation of the concept of democracy, right? Just a one-to-one voting system. So a concept usually starts out as an idea in someone's mind. A concept is written down on paper, usually as a hypothesis. So now we're starting to make the connection to scientific literature. A concept is written down on paper, usually as a hypothesis or a specification, right? So that's one step towards reality. And then a concept is implemented. So it's brought into reality. And this is not very exciting, but just to make sure everybody understands, here's a concept, a writing utensil. Right, that is arguably a concept. If I was going to write down the concept of writing utensil, I would say a tool that can be used to communicate with others using symbols drawn by a person or animal. That's how I define writing utensil in my mind. Implementation, the implementation of a writing utensil is a pencil, or that's one implementation. So a pencil is a type of writing utensil, or more specifically, it is the implementation of a writing utensil, right? With a pencil, graphite is used to write down on a piece of paper. So it's one implementation of a writing utensil. It's a very exciting one, isn't it? Everybody think they know the difference between concept and implementation now? It's not difficult. If somebody points it out to you, it's very easy to understand. But it's just, by the way, you need to separate these two things in your mind because they're different. Here's where it gets more interesting. There are many different implementations of a writing utensil or any concept. So there's a 1 to n mapping of concept to implementation, where n is actually infinity in this case. So think of all the writing utensils that exist. If everybody holds up their pen or pencil in this room, they're all going to be different. If everybody holds up their pen and pencil at the university, probably they're all going to be different. Try to find another person at the university with the same pen and pencil as you. Maybe they're not all different, but they're going to be generally different. Essentially, an unlimited variety of different implementations of a writing utensil exists. Right? You have chalk. You have pens, you have pencils, you have markers. There's just an endless, you could use blood, like your finger and blood. Like there's an infinite number of I could use this, it's not a very good choice, but I could use this spoon, like, and try to scratch something into the wall. So this is important. For a given concept, there may be many different implementations. So that's important. And this is really important when reading or writing a research paper, to make the distinction between concept and implementation, the what and the how. Very, very important. And you might be wondering, well, why is that so important? Again, my psychic powers are starting to kick in. So guess what? The good news is when we're reading a research paper, we're trying to extract the concept. So the content in the research paper describes the concept and the implementation of that concept in every research paper. We are here and we are trying to extract the concept, not necessarily the implementation. So that divides the content up of the paper into two categories. And one category is much more important than the other. Right? So the concept, we want to focus on the concept of all of our research papers. What conceptually are the authors trying to achieve This is the information you're trying to extract when you see a research paper. What is the hole that people get trapped in? The hole is that people get trapped in the how. The how is not important, actually. It's the what that is important, and maybe the why, right? What is the goal of the research paper? This is also called contribution of the paper. What is your contribution to scientific knowledge? What does this paper contribute to the world? That's a concept. And that's what you're trying to extract from all of your research papers. Not the how, actually, the concept. Every paper has an implementation. How is this concept realized, right? Often the concept is stated as a hypothesis, like, we believe that the election results are false, right? That's a hypothesis, right? No, that's just a coincidence that that example comes into my mind. How is the concept realized? How do authors support their hypothesis? How do they implement the concepts? That's the less important information when you're trying to navigate the sea of literature. That's the less important. And in some cases, it's irrelevant. In some cases, it's not completely irrelevant. So these are the essentials of every research paper. The concept, the implementation, but with much less emphasis on the implementation than you're used to giving. Much less. The related work is also important. So most research papers, not all of them, but the good ones, the best ones, have a related work section that discusses the predecessors. And the best ones single out one or two predecessors that they compare themselves to and advance knowledge from, right? And we want to identify what they are. We want to identify one or two previous papers, generally speaking, from the previous work that are most closely related to the current work. Now, if you're working with data, most of you are working with data. Some of you might not be, but most people in science are. The characteristics are very good and important to extract as essential information when you're looking through the literature. Is the data spatial, for example? Is it in 2D, laid out in 2D space? Is it on a surface? Is it volumetric? Is the data time dependent? Does it change over time, or is it just a single time shot, a snapshot? Right? What's the resolution and the size of the data set? These are just all the data characteristics that you can extract from most scientific research papers. Not all of these are going to be applicable for all of your research questions, but these are examples. Is the data multi-resolution or adaptive resolution, or is it uniform? Right? That's a big challenge. Are the data samples given on a structured or unstructured grid, or is there what kind of structure? Is it abstract data, scalar data, vector data, or tensor data? Is it multivariate data? All very challenging characteristics, data characteristics. So that's it. And you can take this template and then fill it in for each paper. So you can say, okay, these are the essential things I have to look for when I'm reading a research paper. I'm going to put it into a template and systematically extract the essentials of a research paper for my literature survey. And using this strategy, I can determine the solved and unsolved problems. So these are the essentials. We want to extract the concept, that's also called the contribution or the hypothesis in each paper. We want to look at the implementation, that's also called the method in some bodies of literature, like bioscience, for example. But this is going to be much less than what you're used to or what you think is important. We're going to take the how and shrink it down to 2 sentences, like 1 or 2 sentences. So that eliminates a massive amount of information from the vast sea of information. We want to extract the most important related work. We want to extract data characteristics. We might, you take this generic template and it needs to be customized for your individual problem. This is the starting template though. You might want to make a note of analysis techniques or analysis strategies that are used. You may want to note what the application to which application is the concept in the paper presented applied to. And you might have some other information that you feel is very appropriate for your particular needs. Like, for example, a sample image from the paper. That's always nice to have when you have a paper that you're summarizing, to see a sample, like your favorite image from the paper. That's not always possible, unfortunately. Some papers have no images. Has anybody come across papers with no images before? It's so horrible, isn't it? It's like, oh, no. Those are the worst. It happens sometimes, though. Really, it does happen, but those papers aren't very good. Okay, so let's jump into some examples. Now that we've gone through all the background information, let's look at this idea in action, extracting the essentials of action. Are there any comments or questions so far, by the way?
About the distant reading, where would I find such a representation of the data or of an article in its like theoretical environment?
In a literature survey.
Alright, so I basically search for the literature survey before I start my...
Yes, definitely. And guess what? I think you have some psychic powers. I'm getting some signals. Mm-hmm. Because the next lecture is on that topic, the literature survey, writing the literature survey. These two go together, so how to extract the essentials from a single paper, that's what we're focusing on. But the goal is to get the whole survey. So the next lecture focuses on the survey, how to take the individual pieces and put them together into a collection called a literature survey. So yes, you have some future, like some sort of future psychic abilities to see the future, I think. Which department are you in?
Human geography.
Okay. I wasn't expecting those powers to come from human geography. I expected you to say physics. I don't know why. But yeah, I guess human geographers could have more psychic powers. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know if there's a relationship there. So here's an example from computer science, our favorite topic, obviously. So you don't have the original papers, by the way. I have uploaded them to Blackboard. So you can see this paper, the original research paper on Blackboard. So you don't actually get to go through the process. This is just the end result of taking that paper and extracting the essentials, and this is it. These are the essentials of this paper. So the title of this one happens to be Fast and Resolution Independent Line Interval Convolution by Detlef Stalling and Hans Christian Hege from 1995. Now that's not going to be that meaningful for all of you, right? Because you're not actually researching this particular topic. But this is what extracting the essentials looks like. So the concept is the most important part. The paper presents a faster version of the original line interval convolution algorithm. It takes the original algorithm and makes it almost interactive. That is the concept of the paper. That is their contribution. They've taken an existing process and they've made it 10 times faster. That is their contribution. Now, how did they do that? The rest of the paper is about how they did it. You can extract the concept just from the abstract and the introduction. The rest of the pages are about how they did it. Right? So we take that how and we just reduce it to 2 sentences. We try to figure out, okay, what is the idea here? What's the general idea behind the how? They achieve this by reducing the number of redundant streamline computations. Right? They also use an improved streamline integrator with adaptive step size control. So that's technical, but it takes the complexity of how and it shrinks it down to just 2 sentences. Now, in this paper, the related work part is very easy. It has a related work section, and it's very easy to see that there's one previous paper that they're trying to make faster. It's very easy in this one. This is not always that easy. And then here are the characteristics of the data they're working with. And there's a sample image. And you might be wondering, I'm getting psychic waves again. I'm starting to pick up signals. You're thinking, but Bob, how can we do this? How can we do this? Am I right? It's a skill. This extracting the essentials is a skill, right? It takes practice. So now you have a skill, a new skill you can practice, right? You didn't know that this skill even existed maybe before today. Now you know the skill exists, and now you can practice the skill. I think that you'll get the hang of this very quickly when you read abstracts and introductions. I think that's an easy part to learn. Oh, extracting the concept, not very difficult. Boiling the implementation down to 2 sentences, that's non-trivial. That takes practice. But that's another skill that you can learn quickly. And it's not that important. This is another skill, but it's mostly just searching through the literature to find. And then this part is pretty easy, right? Just extracting the data characteristics. So that's one example from computer science. We're going to go through other examples quickly because I see that the time is running out. So you can extract some other essentials, right? That's not a comprehensive list. It's just a starting point. You might think about making some notes about analysis techniques. What are the basic analysis techniques or strategies that are used? And you might look at the application domain, right? Where are these things being applied? Like, in what situation are these techniques being applied towards what? What goal? Here's another one from computer science, but it has these two extra fields. The concept, one sentence. The concept is usually just one sentence. It could be 2 sentences. This paper describes a novel algorithm for the construction of isosurfaces or large isosurfaces. The implementation is boiled down to one sentence, but the sentence does have 6 steps. It has there are 2 papers that are closely related. That was easy with this paper because it has a nice related work section, and you can see, oh, they're building on this, specifically saying they're building on these previous papers. Getting the data characteristics is quite easy from this paper. Anybody could pick it up and do that. This happens to be something called volume visualization and isosurface rendering, so I've just made a note. And the application here happens to be medical visualization. So it's being applied for medicine, right? So a medical scientist would be interested in this, right? And that's a picture of some bone structure, right? Who here is from physics? So I see not that many physics people here. Here's an example from physics. Has anybody seen this paper before in physics? So this is a fun example. Nobody's seen it? This is the world's most cited physics paper. Like the #1 cited physics paper on the planet. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? So how would we apply this principle to the world's most cited physics paper? Well, it's a literature review. Funny enough, this is a survey paper. So the number one paper is a survey paper. So the concept is it's a literature review paper of particle physics. It's a reference paper used if you want to look up all of the known particles in physics for particles that have been detected and ones that haven't yet been detected. Great. So how did they do it? This is really impressive, right? The review collects data from previous editions, so that it adds over 2,000 new measurements from 644 papers. Right, and then they list evaluate average measured properties of lots of particles. And then the related work are the previous editions of the same survey. Right? Look, there are 129 co-authors. This is just an extreme example. This is not a typical paper. The data characteristics are 30,000 measurements, more than 30,000 measurements. So this is a literature search. It's a reference material for particle physics. And look, you can download it if you want to see it. This is fun, isn't it? Here's one from mathematics. This one is also one of the most highly cited papers in all of mathematics. I don't know if it was #1. I think it is. I think it's #1 for all of mathematics. Mathematicians? Yes, there are some mathematicians here, but not many. Sarah Hummus? The one mathematician. So this is the top cited mathematics paper in all of mathematics. What's the concept? It's software. That's kind of ironic. The next version of a software library called Form is presented. It performs calculations in quantum field theory, right? And the paper describes the new features that they've added to the library. So it's not very difficult for some papers. Some papers, this extraction process is easy, right? You can imagine doing this. And then the implementation, this is a little bit trickier. So this library is implemented in C, right? But it tries to be object-oriented. That's a really bad idea, by the way. It's not interactive, but runs in batch mode. And there are these things called algebraic objects that they describe. And there's in the related work section, they describe a previous library called Shunship that they've that they've identified as the most important predecessor. So actually, this is funny. So the paper does not describe any data. So I looked through the paper and there is no data being described, actually. There are scalars and vectors implied in the descriptions. And the analysis techniques, well, this is a software engineering exercise. This doesn't apply the analysis techniques. And the application domain is quantum field theory or physics. Good stuff. Here's an example from bioscience. Same thing. You can get the concept usually just from the paper title, by the way. We're just about finished. So, procedures are described for the detection and measurement of protein using the Foley-Phenol reagent. Sometimes even small amounts of protein are discovered. So, the Foley-Phenol reagent is a type of protein that's important in bioscience. Any bioscientists? So this is the most cited paper in bioscience of all time. I googled like top cited papers because it's fun, isn't it? I'm sure you've all done the same thing. And it's fun. I thought I was really interested, like, wow, is this template going to work for bioscience? How am I going to be able to do this? I'm not a bioscientist. So the implementation, the conditions under which Foley-Phenol can be used to detect protein are varied with respect to pH, reaction time, concentration of reactants, and substances that may interfere with detection. So that's the method that they used to detect this protein, right? Okay, here's a surprise. For me, it was a surprise. There's no related work section. For me, that's like, I don't think that's a good idea. But so not all research papers have a related work section. I don't think that's a good idea. They've scattered the related work throughout the text. It's scattered. So I had to do some searching. Right? It was more difficult to identify the two most important previous related papers. The data characteristics are these substances, right? The proteins and reagents, right? So the mixing processes, the mixing samples. So they do have some analysis techniques. Right, and this is for biochemical purposes. There's a nice image, right, of their analysis and some of their analysis techniques. So on the x-axis is reaction time in seconds, and then in the y-axis is the concentrations used in some of the mixtures. So they do provide a nice summary of some of their analysis. And then the last example is geography. I've never looked into geography literature before until this lecture. Same with the bioscience. So this was fun. And again, I just Googled top cited geography papers for examples. And this is one of the most top cited geography papers of all time. It's called Secure the Volume, Vertical Geopolitics and the Depth of Power. Right, actually published in the UK, in Durham. So what's the concept? Political geography is usually divided up into 2D surface areas. It's not very difficult to understand, right? The hypothesis here is that if we're going to divide up territory, considering territory as a 2D space is not good enough. We need to consider volume of territory rather than just the area, right? Because we have all these structures that go underground like tunnels, and we have airspace too. So we need to consider volume, not just area when creating divisions. How does the author support his hypothesis? He goes through by examples. So he's collected a bunch of examples of problems that have arisen because people have divided up space based on 2 dimensions instead of 3, right? So that's the data analysis. It's a case. It's an argument made by a case study rather than a specific data-oriented process, right? And he discusses some different cases of borders that have been very complicated due to their 3-dimensional nature. Again, this paper had no related work section, which is too bad. It does make life a little bit more complicated. Sometimes the related work section is mixed together in with the introduction, and that's what happened here, right? The data characteristics are just the properties of territories, including walls, buildings, tunnels, and other structures. The analysis technique is by example, and this is for political geography. And that's just an image of an underground tunnel from one of the case studies. I threw in a little teaser. This is a teaser of papers being put into a survey following this template format as an intermediate step before the literature survey is finished, right? So these templates, you have a template for each paper, and then you group the papers together. Right? This is just a snapshot of an intermediate process. So a student has summarized the papers, put them into this template with the sample images, and then I've looked at it and made some corrections and suggestions before the next version. And just one final note, because I'm using my psychic powers again. You're wondering, well, what about the case when you do need to know the details about how? That's what this slide is about. So the PhD program starts with breadth. That's where we start. We start with breadth. You're trying to get an overview, right? The depth phase is later on. So depth follows breadth. So once you've decided what you want to be your contribution and work on your unsolved problems, you might go back and identify a few papers that you want to look at in more depth, right? And this is just a little note that when papers are published, not all the details are in there, right? Papers have a limit, 8 pages, maybe 12 pages, maybe 20, which means that things have been left out, but you never know what's been left out. So the how part that we've de-emphasized is not even completely described. So it might not be possible to even extract the complete how from a research paper. It's good to know. If you're wondering about how, or you're wondering about a research paper, write to the authors. They're out there. They're alive. If you have a question about a paper, drop them an email. They love to get correspondence like, wow, somebody's read my paper and has a question about it. Don't be afraid to write to those authors even though you've never met them. I did this all the time when I was a PhD student. Unfortunately, it's not very common. But when I was a PhD student, I was doing distance learning. I wasn't at a university. There were no other students, no other professors. Just me, so I wrote to the authors directly and asked them questions, and they loved it, right? They always responded, and I ended up publishing with some of them later on. So don't be afraid to do that. And just wrapping up, good research directions are difficult to identify based on a single paper, so you need a collection, right? Unless the reader is already expert, and that's one of the reasons we write surveys. And as one of the audience members pointed out, don't forget to check for existing survey papers on a topic before you think about writing one. Any questions? Exciting stuff, isn't it? Very exciting stuff. And here are the papers that we talked about. There's a copy of these slides on Blackboard, right, if you're interested in finding out more about the papers that I looked at. And that's it. Happy Thursday.